Well, good morning, A-pushers. Purpose of this video is take a look at topic 9.6, American Challenges in the 21st Century. College Board kind of splits this topic up into a couple of different areas. As you can see on the objective at the very top, there's domestic and international challenges. For the most part in this video, we're going to look at 21st century international challenges, and historically speaking, this means we are going to take a look at the war on terrorism in the 21st century. But just like we normally do in here, we need to take a few minutes and establish some context. And so we're going to back things up into the 1980s or maybe a little bit before the 80s. So let's get to it. In many ways, the global war on terror in the 21st century has roots in the United States involvement in the Middle East, in Western European countries' involvement in the Middle East as well, as you're looking at things in the post-World War II era. If you think back to topic 8.7, America and the World, there were a lot of non-aligned countries that were coming out that didn't really want to take a stance in the Cold War. US versus Soviet, capitalism versus communism. They were kind of in it for their own accord, for their own benefits. So this is going to lead to some interactions that the United States is going to have in this part of the world during the Cold War. So in this Cold War involvement in the Middle East, for the most part, American interaction has been in support of the nation of Israel, which was established in 1948. And once that was established, because of the land allotments and the relocation of peoples that happened, there was a series of conflicts between Israelis and Middle Eastern Arab groups, Arab countries, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. In 1978, and we're jumping way ahead on this, those conflicts were going on in the 60s and 70s primarily, but in 1978, President Carter helps negotiate the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. And so this level of success, because this is going to have Egypt and Israel establish diplomatic relations with each other, and it's a sign of progress and acceptance. And there was some real thought in the late 70s that this was going to lead to an American acceptance, or like an acceptance of peace in the Middle East. And there was really a sense of positivity that was going on with this, which is kind of unique for the 1970s, just in general. This is met with like some real extremism on both sides, because while the leaders of Israel and Egypt both, sign off on this, Menachem Begin from Israel and Anwar Sadat from Egypt, they are met with resistance in their home countries. And by 1980, Sadat has been assassinated because of his acceptance of the state of Israel. So there's tensions that have built up here, despite there being some kind of progress. It's kind of like we've seen in the civil rights movement at home. There's a little bit of progress, but each piece of progress is met by greater resistance. At the end of the Carter administration, the U.S. involvement in the Middle East has a lot to do with the Iranian hostage crisis. In Iran in the 1950s, the United States helped support and put the Shah of Iran into place. And by 1978, in Iran, Islamic fundamentalists had overthrown the Shah's regime, and there was some growing tension between the new government there and the United States in their support for the Shah. In 1979, when the Shah was in hiding in the United States, seeking medical treatments in the United States, there were 50 American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Iran that were captured, and they were held as hostages for 444 days, from the end of 1979 until the beginning of 1981. And this crisis really got to be emblematic of some of the struggles that the U.S. was facing in the 1970s in general, that the Carter administration was facing and making progress in much of any direction. But by the time you get to the beginning of the Reagan years, the Iranian hostage crisis has been resolved, and there's just this sense of tension. And while there is an American presence that's there, it's kind of an uneasy presence that is going on in the Middle East, from, well, several different perspectives. Throughout the decade of the 1980s, still kind of talking about Iran on this, there is an on-again, off-again conflict between Iran and Iraq through the entire stretch of the 1980s, through both terms of the Reagan administration. In this conflict, the United States is openly supportive of Saddam Hussein. Saddam was the dictator. He was the leader of Iraq, and because he was taking an anti-Iranian stance, the United States was very open in their support for Saddam Hussein's government. But as we've talked about in class separately, with the Iran-Contra affair, the United States was also secretly supporting Iran in this war. And so the fact, and when revelations started to come out in the late 80s, that the United States has actually been offering military support to both sides, it kind of gives this notion that the United States was working just to kind of weaken what was going on in the Middle East, and how this was maybe about trying to pursue 100% American interests to the detriment of anybody not in the United States. In Cold War context for this, between 1988 and the 1992 Persian Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War in 1992, the Cold War ended. And so this American dynamic about how everything is developing, there's a change. And so in 1992, when Saddam Hussein, here he is again, and, he launches an invasion of Kuwait to try to replenish, oil reserves and try to replenish resources that his country has expended throughout the decade-long war. The United States and a coalition of peacekeeping forces embark on Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, and there is again an example of American intervention here. This is kind of like the interventions that we've seen in the 1980s, whether it's Libya or Grenada or even Beirut. But here in this case, this is really seen as being a resounding success. And since this is now happening outside of a Cold War backdrop, there gets to be more and more questions about what is the actual American goal in involvement in the Middle East, and what role should the United States be playing, both from an American perspective as well as from a Middle Eastern perspective. So throughout the 1990s, the United States is in the midst of a debate on what its proper role should be in global interventionism after the Cold War has ended. And during that time, Al-Qaeda is organizing itself as an anti-American and anti-Western group to try to eliminate an American presence in different parts of the world. And so in the 1990s, Al-Qaeda is it's grown and it's had a lot of development and action, and it's just kind of like it almost is for some reason, it's imperceptible to Americans while this is happening. In 1998, there's a series of embassy bombings that take place in different parts of the world, but most notably for the United States, the bombings of the American embassy in Kenya and in Tanzania, happening, as part of almost a simultaneous attack in over a couple of dozen cities around the world. As revelations kind of come through, and this seems to be clearly the product of Al-Qaeda, terrorist activities. There are questions about what the United States should be doing and could be doing to try to prevent this. In the summer of 2000, there is a similar attack on a different kind of scale that happens against the USS Cole. The USS Cole is in the Persian Gulf, part of an American military naval presence that's there, and there is a suicide bomb that is put on board a rowboat, and as it kind of gets close to it, it kind of detonates and it blows a hole in this American naval ship. The picture here, this is the Cole on board a larger freighter to try to take it in for repairs. But if you want to pause and try to see if you can zoom in, like right here, this is kind of like there's a hole blown in the side of this, and that explosion killed a couple of dozen American servicemen. And so this is kind of like some increasing level of attacks that is getting some attention from U.S. military intelligence, but very unfortunately for very many people, there's not enough action that's made to kind of like stop this from happening any further. And so on September 11th, 2001, there's a coordinated Al-Qaeda attack against the United States involving the hijacking of planes. And as planes are flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York, and as another plane is flown into the U.S. Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and as a fourth plane is flown into the ground in Pennsylvania, and the fourth plane was allegedly on its way to go, dive bomb into the United States Capitol building. As this really stands, it's an attack that is going to kill upwards of 3,000 Americans. It is one of the deadliest days in American history, putting itself alongside Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Antietam during the American Civil War. It's the first time in almost 200 years that there has been an attack on mainland United States soil. This hasn't really happened since the War of 1812. And so this is a real changing point for American foreign policy. What ends up coming out as an impact of this is like the debates on the proper role for the United States and the rest of the world has stopped altogether so far as a post-Cold War kind of context. And now that context it changes its demeanor to take us into current times over the role of the United States in the world in the global war on terrorism. And as our content pushes full on into the 21st century, this is where it really is useful just to kind of keep track of the big trend on this, because the war on terrorism for the United States is going to be characterized by military efforts against terror cells, whether that is going to be Al Qaeda or a few years later the addition of ISIS as a terror cell in different parts of the world. And this is also going to be characterized by lengthy, controversial military conflicts. And this is kind of like this is the big statement so far as the College Board is concerned. So this is kind of like the verbiage that College Board is making sure that you are aware of. So far as fleshing this out a little bit, within a couple months after the September 11th attacks, the United States launches Operation Enduring Freedom to try to eliminate Taliban, the Taliban altogether from their locations in Afghanistan. But there gets to be questions about what's the end goal for this military operation. So in the early part of 2021, President Biden announced there was going to be a final closure to this, and there was going to be a final withdrawal of American troops coming home from Afghanistan. And within a few months, Taliban elements start to make their way back into the Afghani government. So this is, raising some questions about the efficacy of the war on terrorism and the legitimacy and of achieving the goals that the war on terrorism is kind of putting out there. In 2003, the United States launches another military operation into Iraq. This time, it is dedicated fully to the removal of Saddam Hussein as a dictator there. There's been a steady string of, questions and concerns about human rights violations. There were military strikes that were ordered against areas in Iraq in the 1990s, but here by 2003, there are enough concerns about the possibility of weapons of mass destruction that the United States President George W. Bush orders a full-scale military operation against Iraq, and that's going to lead to the removal of eventual execution of Saddam Hussein as their leader. U.S. military operations ceased there in 2011, and it's been a little bit more stable in the years since then, but there is definitely some tension that goes on in the Middle East, whether you're talking about Afghanistan, this, I guess, outside of the Middle East, but South Central Western Asia, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and tensions with Iran persist through today as well. And so there's plenty of questions and concerns going through this. The United States is also the reaction on the war on terror also has some impacts on the home front, because in late 2001 Congress passes the USA Patriot Act. So usually it's the Patriot Act. This is designed to improve security within the United States. Among other things, this is going to help establish the Department of Homeland Security and create a more streamlined military intelligence community for the U.S. government. But this is also going to raise questions about protection of civil liberties and human rights for American citizens, because provisions of the Patriot Act include a wide range of government powers that allow the federal government to, surveil its citizens. Phone taps, surveillance cameras, really kind of falling through anybody that's seen as being a suspect in terrorist activity. And quite unfortunately, this is going to lead to some targeting and some alleged harassment that goes on from against Asian Americans, as they are suspected of being Al Qaeda terror cells within the United States. As things move forward out of the 2000s into the 2010s, things kind of moderate for the most part on the Patriot Act. The law is renewed and revised over the course of several years. But as of the middle of 2020, all provisions of the Patriot Act were, set to expire, and so this law has now gone off the books. But I think you can kind of see that the war on terror, kind of like the Cold War, but a little bit closer to home on the timeline for us, it's not just an early 2000s thing. It's something where the actions there are definitely still having an impact on how things run for us in the 2020s. So this is the College Board look at what we need to know so far as international challenges for the 21st century for the United States. We'll revisit the rest of 9.6 and look at the domestic side in the next, and it looks like the final online lecture that we'll have for you this year. So thanks for listening.